which is fantastic from our February meeting. So I'm Tammy Sufi with Tool Design. We also have on, as part of the presentation, Travis Pendleton from Vireo, and you'll hear from her later in the meeting. But before we start to get into too much detail, I am going to go through some housekeeping items, and they are very similar to the ones we did in February. So just bear with us for a couple minutes while we make sure everybody kind of understands how this meeting is going to be run. So first, I just wanted to say, if you do need any translation services into Spanish, you can click that translation button on the menu bar. You can also send a message to the host in the chat, and she'll create a Spanish-speaking breakout room. So if you have any issues with that, just send a message to the host in the chat, and we'll try to troubleshoot that with you. We were having a little issue with it before. The next thing I wanted to mention is that you can click on items in your menu bar. You can mute or unmute yourself, and we're asking that you stay muted for now. You can raise your hand with questions. You can also, of course, chat the host or anyone else on the call. Everybody should be muted. As I mentioned before, if you're on your phone, you can use *6 to mute and unmute. We also have the closed captioning option, so you should be able to see that on the bottom part of your screen or on your menu, and you can just click closed captions to see that. And if you don't like where it's positioned, you can just click and drag that to another part of your screen. If you are joining by phone and want to link your audio to your computer, just find your participant ID on the home screen, and then you can you can punch in your audio code, and it's just the pound and the number and then pound again. So that will help us see who's talking. And then I just wanted to mention that this call is being recorded, or this presentation is being recorded, so that we can post that onto the website after the meeting. So I wanted everybody to be aware of that. And then the last thing, and this is really important, if you could just put your name and then also your email address and your organization into the chat. If you're comfortable doing that, then we'll have a good record of who attended the meeting. So with that, we're going to get started. But I did just want to say once again, if anybody needs Spanish translation, we have that available. And Linda, if you could just translate that so people know to ask for that in the chat and to click the translation button. And Linda, you'll have to unmute.
Una vez más, si necesitan interpretación, por favor, déjenos saber.
Okay, it may have cut off a little bit. You want to do it one more time?
Si usted necesita interpretación al español, por favor, déjenos saber para poder comenzar a hacer la interpretación.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, we want to go ahead and get started. We have some really exciting things to present to you today. We've been going through we've been going through all the input that we got in February, and we have been putting that into draft recommendations. And I'm just going to pause for 1 second. Linda, I don't think the translation's working right. Miranda and Linda, it's in with the full group. Can we put the translation into the breakout room or the translation room?
I'm afraid we're still having some difficulties with that. I can create a breakout room. I will create a breakout room so the interpretation button isn't functioning as it normally should. I apologize.
Okay.
Create a breakout room for that.
Okay, and then if anybody needs that translation, if you could chat the host, that would be great. Okay, so hopefully we can get that worked out. Sorry about that. Okay, so our meeting agenda, we're going to get started with a quick recap of the February meeting. I know a lot of you attended those, but we'd like to give a quick recap on that. And then also we're going to go through the draft recommendations and ask for your comment on those. And then we'll talk about our timeline for next steps.
Y de ahí hablaremos a lo que sigue a futuro.
Okay, so we had great meetings in February. I think we had a really fantastic turnout. We had 9 different public workshops and 10 focus groups, and we heard all sorts of things. We talked a lot about the goals and the vision for the plan, and we got fantastic comments for everybody, from everybody who participated. We have summarized all of that input, and that's available on the Kansas ATP Active Transportation Plan website. And we encourage you to go and look at that. We used mural boards, as those of you who attended the meeting remember, where we were able to have participants use Post-it notes and really had a great dialogue and a lot of back and forth about what people would like to see as far as active transportation in the state of Kansas, and what are some of your ideas for how the state can move forward and how KDOT can really help make active transportation an integral part of Kansas transportation system. So just a really quick recap of some of the themes that we heard as far as the public comments. We heard a lot about people really wanting true transportation choices. They wanted things to be safe, connected, and funded. Those were some things that we heard a lot about. We also heard and talked about equity, and equity meaning many different things. So equity between people, and making sure that people of all ages, all abilities, all backgrounds are served by the transportation system. We heard about wanting more equity between modes of transportation. And then we also heard about equity between urban and rural parts of the state. We heard a lot about connectivity and wanting to make sure that people could get to where they wanted to go by walking and biking, and some of the key places that you felt were important to connect to are jobs, food, healthcare, schools, parks. And we heard a lot about the basics, really wanting to get to those basic services. And then we heard a lot about ideas for more partnerships between health, tourism, and transportation. So we have worked to incorporate those into the revised vision, goals, and the recommendations that we're going to share today. So we're going to go through quickly the revised vision and goals. You'll see here in red, we made just a really, really simple edit to the vision, and then we have more substantive revisions that were made to the goals. So just again, for those of you who were not part of the February meetings, our vision for active transportation in Kansas is that it will be a place where people of all ages, abilities, and backgrounds have safe and convenient options to walk, bike, roll, and use other active modes for their daily transportation and recreation needs. And then we had a series of goals that we shared, and we've made some slight revisions to these as well. And then some of the input that we heard from the group back in February, we've incorporated in the recommendations that we're going to go through in a minute. So I'm not going to read each one of these one by one, but I do want to highlight some of the changes. So with equity, we strengthened that language a little bit to talk about historically neglected communities and prioritizing populations that rely on active transportation to get around, active transportation and transit. And then we highlighted some of the things that those groups, that it's important for those groups to reach. And then we also talked about addressing the diverse needs of urban, suburban, and rural communities. That's something we heard a lot about in the meetings in February. We added accessibility to our connectivity goal. We heard that that was an important thing to call out. So even though the vision talks about making sure that the transportation is serving all ages and all abilities, there was also a desire to call out accessibility specifically in the revised goals. So we've done that. We cleaned up some of the language that was maybe difficult to understand or not necessarily intuitive. So we've added attractive networks, convenient networks, as opposed to legible. We simplified some of the language around sustainability, and then we added an education goal, which was something that we heard was important to the community when we talked in February. So those are the revisions to the broad goals. But what we really want to focus on in this meeting, and it's a lot to chew on, are the recommendations. So we're going to go through these goal categories one by one. I'm going to step through them somewhat quickly, And then we're going to have an opportunity with Travis to do an exercise where we're going to slow down and go through these goals one by one and the recommendations for them and get some of your input on these. So bear with us, it's a lot of information. This will also be posted on the website after these meetings, and there will be other ways for you to provide input. So feel free to use the chat as needed, but also know that we're going to do a Mentimeter exercise, which is an online polling. So if you don't have your phone nearby, you might want to get that. That's probably going to be the easiest way to be engaged in this meeting since we have a large group. So the first goal that I wanted to talk about in the recommendations are safety. And we've categorized these into speed and design, education, data collection and analysis, and revisions to existing laws, or in some cases, new laws. So hopefully you can see these pretty well on your screen. A lot of this is about making sure that the design of our roadways is safer for bicyclists and pedestrians and other active transportation users. One of the primary things that means is reducing vehicle speeds so that the likelihood of collisions that result in serious injury or death is less. Some of these recommendations relate back to our crash study and crash analysis. So we're looking at, particularly in commercial and Main Street areas, slower speeds, and then also more infrastructure for bicyclists and pedestrians that provides more separation from motor vehicle traffic. We're recommending using some additional crossing guidance that came from an earlier report that KDOT worked on with FHWA for the guidance related to when crossings are marked and when those are installed. We are looking at, and this comes out of our crash analysis, focusing safety efforts on higher volume roadways that have lower posted speeds on urban roads, particularly 4-lane undivided roads. Now, that one takes a second. It seems somewhat counterintuitive that you would focus some of your safety efforts on lower posted speed roads, but the reason for that is that's where there's the most bicycle and pedestrian activity. And so those roadways in the 30-mile-per-hour range that have high volumes, that's where we tend to see a lot of pedestrian and bicycle crashes. So we really want to focus some of our safety efforts on those, particularly on those 4-lane roads that are undivided. So we know that from our crash study. We want to look at more lighting, particularly of crossings and intersections, and then increasing the design resources, particularly related to bridges and overpasses, which we know serve as barriers. We also think that there's a need for improvement in terms of data collection and analysis, so institutionalizing more data collection so we have better information about active transportation users and their safety issues. And then there's several laws that some of you may have heard before. We've talked about this a little bit in our core team meeting with stakeholders about lowering the statutory speed limits so that we're at least starting with a baseline of, in residential neighborhoods, 25 miles per hour. Currently it's 30 miles per hour statutory speed limit. Cities can lower it, but that's the default. We're recommending a vulnerable road user law, and those deter poor driving behaviors by mandating punishments for dangerous driving that injure or kill pedestrians and bicyclists. And then we are recommending increasing the specificity and awareness of the dooring law. So being more cautious when opening a doorway in a path where a bicyclist might be present. Okay, that was just safety. Education. Our recommendations here are about both driver education as well as biking education and walking education for youth, and then more opportunities for adult bicycle education, or refresher courses, as they're sometimes called, for adults who maybe haven't really bicycled since they were a child. They need a refresher on both the use of the bicycle, but also in terms of the safety when operating in motor vehicle traffic. And there's some great examples from like Bike Walk KC and Bike Walk Wichita and some other groups that just have some really great examples that we'd like to see available on more of a statewide level. We also have a recommendation in here for funding more positions that provide education and promotion of active transportation. So in the new federal transportation and infrastructure bill, it looks very likely that safe routes to school coordinators may be funded again at the state level. That would be fantastic. That's something that we've put in our recommendation. But then in addition to that, we'd like to see more mobility management, transportation demand management. So that's getting people, say, in the workplace to consider other options for commuting to work, using transit, active transportation, et cetera. And then also more funding of health and wellness educators that can help encourage and promote more physical activity and active transportation. And then the final thing is more technical education and training at the state DOT level for technical staff, but then also for local agencies and for private consultants. So really trying to raise the bar in terms of design and planning across the state, really making sure that things are up to the latest best practices in terms of design for active transportation users. Okay, moving on to equity. If you remember, the overarching goal is really about investing in historically neglected communities and prioritizing their needs. One thing that we think is really going to be important in order to be able to do that is better data. So developing some equity measures and criteria that can be used to then help channel more funding to historically neglected communities. So really developing those criteria that help us determine which neighborhoods, which parts of the state really need this additional funding and prioritization. And then the next piece of that is actually prioritizing those groups, starting with things like sidewalks, crossings, bike facilities, and access to transit. Those are really the key place to start. And this would be, again, to target those areas with high percentage of low-income residents, people of color, low car ownership, and then essential services like schools, employment, et cetera. And then the third category here is funding and technical assistance. So developing more funding programs that have a set-aside amount to build non-motorized infrastructure in rural communities. We heard a lot in the public meetings that it was difficult for rural communities to compete with the urban and suburban areas in terms of getting KDOT funding. So we're recommending developing some set-asides for those rural communities for active transportation infrastructure. And then also looking at technical assistance in both planning and design as another way to help make sure that low-income communities, communities of color, youth, seniors, and then our smaller communities across the state are really able to kind of participate in a lot of these transportation programs at the same level as our urban areas. I feel like this is a lot, so I thank you guys all for bearing with me. We're trying to cover a lot of information, and then we will, like I said, we'll pause with Travis on each one of these and get some of your input. Okay, one thing I didn't mention when I started off is that while we've organized these recommendations for now under the specific goals, there is a lot of overlap. So especially once we start to get into these next couple categories of mobility, connectivity, and accessibility, you'll see that some of our recommendations really could fall on the slide that they're on, or maybe they could fall on another slide just as easily. So I just wanted to mention that because probably what we'll end up doing in the plan is shifting to having, you know, our high-level goals followed by a whole series of recommendations with some sort of icons or something following them, or a table that indicates which different categories of goal they address, because there is quite a bit of overlap. The important thing is that we get all of these recommendations in here, so I wouldn't worry too much about them being under the right goal category. So for mobility, we heard a lot in our February meetings about needing a greater sort of culture of active transportation in the state of Kansas, or kind of just acceptance of active transportation. So some of the ideas that we came up with here are promotional campaigns, just to increase the number of people who use active transportation modes, having a unique statewide program or a signature event to promote active transportation. So this is not an active transportation idea necessarily, but you know, in the city of Seattle, they used to, or maybe they still have a program that's where the whole city, it was organized by their library system, and the whole city reads the same book. And that's kind of the idea. And that's kind of the idea with this too, like have a unifying event across the state on a particular date. Maybe it's a sunflower stroll or something along those lines, just to get people to buy into this idea of active transportation and to try it out. We've also put in some ideas here about integrating transportation demand tools into incentives at the state level employee benefit programs. So points or discounts on health insurance based on how active you are, things like that. So we want to look into some of those types of programs more. We also have, and this goes back to the sort of acceptance of how things might be different for walking and bicycling, is implementing a full Idaho Stop Law that allows bicyclists to treat stop signs as yield signs and red lights as stop signs. I'm seeing some thumbs up, so that's good. So we have a law that doesn't quite take us all the way there now. It's a dead red law. So we want to implement the full Idaho Stop Law, and Arkansas has done that. And obviously Idaho has done that too. That's why the law is named that way. Then we're also looking at modifying some current state laws to make those more friendly for e-bike and other electric micro mobility devices like scooters. So some of these things we're seeing coming online, just making sure that the Kansas laws are friendly towards those types of small micro mobility devices. Then we're also talked about safe, attractive, and connected infrastructure. So adopting a statewide complete streets policy that really encourages routinely considering whether or not a bike or pedestrian facility should be on a roadway. And then developing more guidance for active transportation on bridges and overpasses. And then you can see here, I think all of the connectivity and accessibility recommendations that we're going to go through next also relate back to mobility. So the categories for the connectivity and accessibility are land use transportation connections, subdivision and zoning requirements, planning and design, regional routes and trails, and community cohesiveness. So for the land use transportation connections, it's really about making sure that the active transportation, that there are more active transportation plans in communities of all sizes, not just our larger communities, to really ensure connected networks. And that's obviously going to be really tied to land use and destinations. And then in particular, prioritizing those networks that help reach schools, recreational facilities, transit services, and essential services and jobs. Routine considerations. So again, kind of going back to that complete streets idea of really with each project, really making decisions about whether or not bike and ped facilities should be included. And then working with school systems and Department of Education to site schools in a way that they are walkable and encourage walking and biking to school. Subdivision requirements, this is looking at things like best practices in terms of separation from traffic with both the bike facilities and our sidewalks, making sure sidewalks aren't right up against the curb and right up against motor vehicles. Encouraging Kansas communities to adjust their zoning to require short and long-term bike parking, but also end-of-trip facilities. So this is something else that we heard in the public meetings in February. It's things like showers in larger office buildings, lockers for bikes, long-term parking, some of those things that just make it easier to commute by bike. And then planning and design, again, providing some planning and design resources to communities to help elevate the state of planning and design across the state. And then developing best practices for routine maintenance and repair, and to ensure accessible sidewalks, ramps, crossings. We have some other related goals back in the safety, or related recommendations back in the safety goal. And then the two last categories, regional routes and trails. So really providing for some more opportunities to connect between various rural communities. That's something we heard in the February meeting. The Rails to Trails facilities are very popular, and there was a desire to look at supporting more of those and more Rails to Trails development, particularly in rural areas. And then the final one is community cohesiveness. So really looking at how we can reduce barriers that divide communities, such as bridges and overpasses, highways, things like that, both in terms of existing ones and future plans, really making sure that we're not dividing our communities when we build important infrastructure. Okay, these last couple categories are largely covered by some of the early recommendations. So one of the questions that we're going to have for you in a few minutes is, do we want to consolidate some of these goals either into the vision or back into some of the other goals as they start to overlap? But one goal that we did here was really important, was health. And for this, one of our, really our main recommendation is to do more partnering with both state and local health agencies to promote and fund active transportation. And then we've just listed a number of these categories where there's a lot of overlap between the community health goals and transportation goals in terms of having more physical activity in our daily lives, having safe streets, encouraging folks to commute actively to work, and then of course safe routes to school, safe routes to healthy food are both programs that have grown quite a bit in recent years. So we'd like to see more of that in the state of Kansas. And then for community vibrancy, again, if we take care of all those other goals and recommendations, we believe we're going to have vibrant communities. But we have separated it out into this specific goal. One of the things that we think is important to include here is promoting active tourism across the state. We'll talk a little bit about it at the end of the meeting, but one piece of this active transportation plan is an economic impact analysis study, and that's underway right now. So we will probably add some specific recommendations under community vibrancy once we have the results of that economic impact analysis. But some of the other goals, of course, like I said, relate back to community vibrancy. And so we'll be building on those in the next couple months. And then we also have our last goal category is sustainability. And this is one, to be really honest, we really kind of struggled here to develop new recommendations that we hadn't already talked about in some of the other categories. So really the basic idea here is to reduce reliance on single occupancy motor vehicles and to encourage more carbon neutral transportation like walking, biking, or transit. It's not neutral, but it's, you know, better. So so that was the idea here, but a lot of the other goals really cover that encouragement of more of those types of activities. So our question for you in a few minutes is going to be, should we keep this as a standalone goal? Should we combine it with other goals or into the vision? Or alternatively, is maintenance and preservation really what we should be addressing here with this final goal? So with that, let that all sink in for a minute. We're going to go back through these, as I said, and Travis is going to walk us through an exercise to do that. Again, I think you're going to want to have your phone handy. That's probably the easiest way. Oh, it looks like part of our code cut off here. But let me hand it over to Travis, and she can help you. The last number on that code is a 4 also, so it's 44 there at the end. But Travis, if you want to take over.
Sure.
And walk us through this exercise.
Okay, everyone, this is the time where we're going to be able to talk and explore these goals. Now, I know that some of the information is cut off. I'm going to put it in the chat. What I'm putting in the chat are two things. One is if you're online right now and you look at the chat, there is a hyperlink in there that will take you to where we're going to collect the comments. It's basically a survey. It has pictures in it, etc. You can click that, or you can open another window on your browser or use your phone and go to menti.com and type in, when you get there, 8707544. It's also in the chat. In a second, I'm going to share my screen and you will find that code at the very top of the screen. Also, if you like to use your smartphone, lots of new phones right now allow you to scan QR codes, and that's what is shown on the far right, that little black graphic there with the white running through it. That's a QR code. You can use that to get there as well. So there's about 3 different ways. What I'm going to do is share my screen, but I need for Tammy to stop sharing hers first. Can you all see my screen? Give me a thumbs up if you can see it, and if you can see the code at the top. Okay. Because I can see my screen, but I can also see my Zoom chat and things like that. If somehow you have a hard time, you can also drop comments in the chat. All the comments that we've been collecting so far from you all, we're grabbing out of the chat as well. So all of that will go into the meeting summary.
Truby, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm going to pop in and say, before we started the Minty, it did say thanks for commenting where we hadn't commented yet. As soon as she flips to the next slide, your phone should refresh. So don't worry about that. Okay.
Thanks, Becca.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide. And so what you should see, give me a thumbs up if you see this. These are just the revised goals. So this is everything consolidated that Tammy was talking about. Now we're going to dig into it. We're going to start with safety. So this is just a capture of the slide. And if you look at the bottom, we really want to know generally, what's your opinion of the safety action steps? If you're on your phone or on your browser, you're doing it now. You can thumbs up, you can thumbs down, you can have a question mark, but I see a lot of thumbs up. I know how many people are in this meeting. There's like 55 of y'all. So we should have lots of voting happening. And we're talking about speed and design. We know that safety is a big component of all transportation projects and is often one of the guiding elements to that in terms of where improvements happen, what types of improvements, etc. You'll note that this safety goal and the action steps also involve education. And as you heard Tammy sharing with you before, we have a whole entire education goal. As we go through each of the topics today, keep on voting. I see about half of you all have voted. And I can tell from the bottom, and you all can probably, you might be able to see this on your screens too, or if you're looking at mine, I'm looking at the bottom right corner, so I can see how many people have voted and how many people haven't. So I'm gonna encourage you all to keep going if you haven't voted yet. But for each of these goals and the action steps for them, you're going to see the same questions. We're going to show them to you. We're going to want to know overall what's your opinion of them. And then we want to know if there's something that we've missed. And you'll have an opportunity to type in through Mentimeter what we may have missed so that we can capture that. And then once we're done with that type of question, we're going to find out from you all which of those topic areas you think is most important. Planning documents are notorious for having lots of topics and sections, and sometimes you run into things like what Tammy was mentioning, where we're wondering, do we really need this? Is it incorporated somewhere else, etc. But once you have all of that, you still need to know what's most important. So where do we start? And so that's why we're going to ask you about where we should prioritize for each of these goals and strategy sections. Okay, you all, there's 35 people. We've got 35 thumbs up, 1 thumbs down, and 1 question mark. There's 52 people in this meeting. Some of you are staff, I know that. And I see we're starting to go up a little bit. Looks like we have 38 people that have voted in some form or fashion. Is there anyone that's wanting to vote that hasn't yet? I see some thumbs up in the chat, or not in the chat, but in the reactions. And I see in the chat, there's a, and we're still asking for Spanish speakers. If you are someone online that's a Spanish speaker, I have a message in the chat, but so far that's all I'm seeing really in the chat. Let's see. Becca, do you see any hands up or anything in the reactions?
I do not.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to assume that most of you all have voted. And so what I see is like, 38 people have voted. I'm going to go to the next, some more people are voting. I'm going to go to the next thing here. Okay, so here are the topics. This is a little bit easier to look at, I would imagine. But these are the categories that we have for the safety goals. We have speed and design, education, as you know, it's its own goal, data collection, analysis, and law. But we really want to know what's missing. So now is your opportunity to tell us what we're missing from our goals area. If we have done a fabulous job and we're not missing anything, then go ahead and say that we're good. But if we are not, and we have missed things, please let us know what that is. Particularly also if you gave a thumbs down or you had a question, let us know what we might be missing. So far we've got good, okay, looking great. All right, events, proactively getting people out and on biking, walking, etc. It's like we're missing some intermediate changes. Quick build, demo projects are key to making interventions in the fast way. Allow funding for quick build programs, okay? It's an implementation element for safety. A little bit hard to comment. What if I do this? I'm gonna go back quickly. Just to refresh for those in case you.
There's also a couple of comments in the Zoom chat here, including the reduction of single-use vehicles. They think that there might happen naturally, but gives fodder to those against bike peds. They could say something like, see, they just want to get rid of cars in the gas industry. It could work against all the other goals if stated explicitly. And another comment from Tim, it says, in my opinion, it isn't enough to decrease statutory speeds. People drive too fast all the time. Decreasing the statutory speed must be coupled with the necessary visual and spatial design changes necessary to convince people to change their behavior.
So those are some new elements, but there's some of those comments are still, I think, contained inside of these topic areas. So I've shared this part again. I'm going to go back and see if there's anything that's missing. Better enforcement for higher speeds, especially in small towns that are bisected by a through highway. There needs to be some legal mechanism to push the adoption of new and innovative infrastructure designs that naturally cause motorists to reduce their operating speeds. Municipalities need to follow through. We need some positive motivation. Okay, who monitors motorized speeds? I got a like for the intermediate quick build comment. Laws need to be stronger. Okay. Let me ask you all this. What do you think then is most important to focus on? We've got our categories: speed and design, education, data collection analysis, the law, and then there could be some other comments based on what you had shared previously. When you're doing this, when you're responding to this comment, you have the option of allocating sort of points to each of these. I think you get 5 points. So if you can see this, go ahead and let us know what you think is most important by allocating your points per each topic. So far, speed and design, but lots of you still need to share your thoughts. Becca, are you seeing anything else in the chat related to safety?
It looks like we have a note here from Bob that said he would like to see an emphasis in rural areas since cyclists like to ride there.
Okay. Looks like about half of you are voting.
I'm also seeing a question from John who's asking, how do you enter the points? So when you're in the Menti, you should have the opportunity to slide left or right the bubble associated with each of the topics. If you are using your cell phone, you just use your finger for that. If you're using the computer, you should be able to click on that and drag it over.
Thanks, Becca. Still got speed and design heading up. Let's see. I see Elizabeth is right with Bob saying absolutely would love to see more share roads on rural roads or share the road signs. And then Jean is saying she's a little jaded, thinks that laws will be tough because there will be such a fight to get anything changed. Okay. Does anyone still need to vote that hasn't voted yet? I know that John had a little bit of a struggle, so I'll give him a moment. And then in the chat, Luke is saying that rural roads could mean gravel on dirt or just paved, not just paved. And gravel has become quite popular for cyclists, especially in Kansas, is what Brandon is adding to that. Okay, speed and design is at the top. Let's look at the next goal.
And Teresa, if I could just jump in for a second, those of you that are weighing in on this, on gravel riding and dirt riding, if you could add anything in the chat specific to recommendations related to that, because I don't think we really have that well covered. So if there's anything specific that comes to mind, please feel free to put that in the chat.
Thanks, Tammy. Okay, so here's the education goal and action steps. So we've got informing users about, of the transportation system, best behaviors practices, increasing safety and comfort. Our categories are educational programs. We're also talking about coordinators for safety, health, and mobility. And then we've got technical education and training. You can thumbs up if you think we're generally okay with this in terms of the action steps, thumbs down if you don't, question mark if you have questions. Under education, we are still talking about, conducting an educational campaign focused on the interaction between drivers and non-drivers. We're talking about best practices for interacting between the two, focusing on youth, also adults with refresher courses on bicycle education, for example. We've got safety, health, mobility coordinators. Sounds kind of fun, but to fund those positions if you want to do that, or if your organization wants to do that, and promote active transportation programs. We know about safe routes to school, and to do more of that, have mobility managers, health and wellness coordinators. With our tech, we're also talking about ADA. I see from Drew in the chat, YouTube PSA commercials would be great. Destinations are safe. I see from Alex in the chat, education for local, regional, and state elected officials, enforcement. Not that he wants to rely on them, but that would be useful. And you all are getting into what the next question is going to be, which is what is missing. So if you've already been voting on this, take a good look at the screen. So that we can hear what's missing on the next screen. People are still voting. Drew's also adding that we need to fight the anti-racist memes currently floating around, assuming on the internet. Elizabeth is talking about an explanation for drivers of the green paint on the urban roads. She gets so many questions about those. Okay, we seem to be always about just over a little under 30 votes each time so far. Here are topics.
Mention that cyclist.
Oh yeah,
cyclist, not racist. Cyclist.
Cyclist. I don't see any thumbs down or question marks on this one. Here are our action step categories. Is there something missing there?
In the chat, we're also seeing a couple of things like basic education about how transportation is currently funded could help, since most people assume it's entirely funded by fuel taxes. And that's from David. And Tim adds that technical education should include focus groups where engineers and other transportation officials actually talk to cyclists and other pedestrians to better understand their needs. He knows plenty of transportation officials who don't ride bikes.
Okay. Yeah, if we're doing well, let us know that. If we're not, definitely add something. Particularly if you have something that's, we're really trying to make sure we cover all of our bases. So, because after this question, we're going to vote. And so when you vote for other, we're assuming it has something to do with the comments that you've made about what's missing, what you put in the chat, things like that. So we've got the education for local officials. So that's a particular audience. Involving cyclists in the design of structures. Really focusing on KDOT's rural engineers being trained in this area. A lot of times we find that bike ped wasn't included in their schooling. Okay. Seem to be really focusing on different audiences to educate and engage. So rural engineers, elected officials, engaging cyclists.
I have something here from Jared. He has a recommendation of every road project location should be walked or biked by the design team, preferably with their family. This is more design related and has a change of perspective.
Education is okay for sure, but passive. The more powerful action is marketing, frequent prompts, and unified messaging on safety for walkers and cyclists, especially directed to drivers to watch seniors, school children, and the disabled. So you get creative about targeting audiences and proactive transportation ideas, education on the benefits of active transportation, find a reason not to include multimodal components rather than to include them. That's really good. It's a different spin on that topic. Ensuring that broad education programs come through a lens of moving people safely to the greatest extent possible, avoiding a cars versus bikes reaction. I also see increase the shoulder on rural paved roads. Got about 16 comments there. Does anyone else want to add anything? Becca, do you see anything in the chat in the meantime?
I think all is quiet on the Zoom front.
Okay. Okay. Oh, create educational materials for dissemination at the neighborhood level. Also on here, commercials on TV and radio about the rules for passing cyclists on the road. Ride the route when designing. Let's see, did I get everything? Events, we have to build the culture around all of this, and that means getting people outside. It's a really great spins on what it means to educate. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go to the next question, which is of the topics that we have here and all the other ideas that you've shared, which should be most important in terms of what we focus on? Is it the educational programming component of it? Is it the coordinators, so the people who are helping to do that? Is it the technical training and education, or some of the other things that you all mentioned? It's like training and coordinators are a little neck and neck almost. Got 10 people voting, 14 people voting so far. 26 people. Education, technical education and training seems to be in the lead now by a little bit. With programming, educational programming and coordinators behind that. Tammy, do you want to add something? Okay, you just showed up on my screen.
It was a technical issue, but yeah, I'm good. This is great.
Okay, 29 people. Is everyone, it seems that okay, we have 30 now. It seems about half of you all vote on this. And there's 49 of you in the meeting, including some staff. How about this? Let's go to the next topic. So this is the equity goal and the action steps. We're focusing on an investment in historically neglected communities, prioritizing the needs of those populations that rely on active transportation. They're trying to get to jobs, they're trying to get to services. And we want to think about not just one character of community, but all characters of community. So you get the urban, suburban, and the rural. Data is a big component of that. And then project prioritization is an important component. For data, we want to have equity measures and criteria so we know what we're looking for. During our other meetings, we talked about what does equity look like, what's it feel like? That's a bigger conversation, so it has become an action step to define what that is. Prioritization, we're thinking about the types of improvements. So we've got the sidewalks, the crosswalks, the bike facilities, and then targeting those to areas where you have high percentages of people with low income, people of color, low car ownership, etc., near schools where people work. Our last category is funding and technical assistance. And I see someone's coming into the meeting. Technical assistance, we're talking about funding programs or set aside amounts that would build your non-motorized infrastructure system in communities where it's difficult to do that, and then providing technical assistance to get that done. Particularly when you're talking about design for low-income communities, communities of color, youth, and seniors, small and mid-sized communities. So again, thumbs up if you like it. We've got 22 thumbs up, no thumbs down, no question marks.
I have a note from Alex here in the chat who says, I like this a lot. I think DOTs and local planning partners haven't focused on this enough or stopped at environmental justice, or AKA the bare minimum.
Okay, there's 48 people in the meeting, 29 have voted. Some more people are voting. Okay, the number hasn't changed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next question, which is what's missing? So again, we're talking about data in terms of measurement of equity. We're talking about prioritizing certain projects in certain locations, and we're talking about the funding for those projects. But what else might be missing from this, the action steps or the categories of action steps for equity? Please use your commenting options to let us know. You can use Mentimeter. If we're doing great, let us know that. There's probably something that's missing, so definitely tell us what it is. And I don't see anything. Give me a thumbs up if you all can see the screen, or thumbs up with your reaction buttons if you can see the screen, or give me a thumbs up. Okay, so I don't see anything. So if we're doing good, just write you're doing good or that it's okay. All right, here comes a comment.
Yeah, and I think if I could just add that I think it's really difficult figure this piece out. And so let's just make sure we give people enough time.
Okay. I was more worried that there was a lockup in the screen and that you couldn't see me or the Mentimeter, but comments are starting to come in. So we need to address the cost of housing and transportation combined. And I think public indices are intertwined with equity as well. Still wrapping my head around the issue. But any thoughts or contributions on this for this project would be great. Rural areas and inner city often have smaller problems. Can in-kind labor be used as matching funds? Sidewalks are really lacking in rural areas and it's almost impossible to walk, especially with a wheelchair or stroller. Forgot I would like to see some kind of funding system that dovetails with local economic development funding initiatives like chambers of commerce, Main Street organizations, EDCs at the county level, nonprofits. Can KDOT work with areas that have metropolitan planning organizations to look at equity beyond just environmental justice? That's what EJ is. And that way, a similar analysis can be used on other metropolitan planning products and processes. So taking a more holistic approach. Cost of housing and infrastructure design, as well as accessibility to healthy foods within reasonable distance. So that's back to transportation and housing combined, and where are you trying to access? Funds are limited, prioritization is critical, it is. Good data is the key to effective prioritization, inclusion of members of desperate populations, and action step implementation processes. People don't assume that urban areas get a lot of attention and funding. Ours definitely does not, even though there are so many low-income children and seniors. Last one is connecting to critical services, especially those providing resources for low-income individuals.
In the Zoom chat, I'm seeing something from Elizabeth that says when she's in Iowa, it seems like a lot of the rural towns have some kind of walking or biking path. How is Iowa able to do that, and what is their funding source? And Alex also commented, in-kind is not a match for most federal funds, the SDP or TAP.
So taking a deeper look at data, taking a deeper look at funding, taking a more comprehensive look at how prioritization happens. Seem to be what I'm hearing. Okay, there are 19 comments in here. Becca, do you see any hands up? You all can use, if you have a question, something that you need clarified, you can also raise your hand with the reaction buttons, which are located in the bottom part of your Zoom menu. If you don't see it, there are 3 dots that say more underneath them, and your reactions are there. I don't see any hands up. I don't see any more questions, or not questions, comments in here. Do you see anything else in the chat, Becca?
Nope, we look good for here.
Okay, let's go to prioritization, and that was already mentioned on what's missing. So we've got data, prioritization, and funding technical assistance. Those were the 3 categories that we had, but then you all added some other content. So which is most important to focus on?
Of course, I said the Zoom looked good from here, and we got a comment that came in from Jean. I think the person who asked about in-kind was wondering if in-kind could be a match for smaller communities with smaller budgets. And I'm thinking that those communities are less than 1,000.
Okay. Okay, 15 of you all have voted so far. Technical assistance is edging out prioritization at the moment. let's see. In the chat from Diana, it says, in our town, which is Sedan, Kansas, I had tried to get sidewalks where there were none, but the city board had to sign some kind of paper. But at this point, I cannot remember the name of it and couldn't even put an application in. So there seems to be an issue with the process to get the sidewalks. Funding and technical assistance is still in the lead, and about half of you all have voted, little smidgen over half. Everyone that wanted to vote voted. See, there's a little over half. There's 44 people here, including staff, and 23 who have voted. We always seem to be about half. I am going to go on to the next question or the next topic. This is mobility. This is all about increasing the regular use of walking, biking, and other active modes of transportation. You know, on our graphics for the Kansas ATP, we're talking about people on scooters, people who board, people who use mobility devices, lots of different ways of getting around. We're talking about the culture and acceptance of active transportation under mobility, and we're also talking about the infrastructure that you need for that, having that infrastructure be safe, attractive, and connected. In order to increase the the acceptance of the culture of active transportation, we've got promotional campaigns in here. I think on some of the other goals, we were talking about marketing. There's a little bit of campaigning, marketing, I would argue, in cultural and acceptance under the mobility goal. We have a citywide program or event, and we heard of events on another goal. Like the idea of the Idaho Stop Law to allow there's the idea of passing an Idaho Stop Law. And I know that somebody in the chat really liked that idea for allowing bicyclists to treat stop signs as yield signs and red signs as stop signs. Modify the current laws for e-bikes is on here. A lot of e-bike electronic mobility devices or micro-mobility devices are in here. Roadway positioning and mandatory use laws, modifying those as part of this. Safety and attractiveness, we've got the complete streets policy in here. And then developing guidance for how and when to accommodate active transportation on bridges and overpasses. And in some parts of, some metropolitan areas, you tend to see more bike ped bridges with Department of Transportation improvement projects, depending on what that department's focus is. Sometimes you see that. And then we also have a reference to looking at the connectivity and accessibility recommendations, because we think there's some overlap there. And seeing 22 thumbs up, no thumbs down, and no question marks. Becca, what do you see in the chat?
So I have a note here from Bob saying he's unable to vote. Right now, we only have the thumbs up, thumbs down, and question mark available. So hopefully you can see those. If not, you'll be able to comment to the next one. And then also we have a comment here from Tim that says special tax credits available for locally owned and operated health and wellness retailers like bike shops, shoe stores, and sports stores.
So as you're voting on this, and as I was chatting through some of them and we're getting some comments, there may have been some things on your mind that were missing in this space. We talk about mobility and the action steps. We really want to know what's missing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next question. I think the voting has stopped on this. So we had two categories: acceptance and safe, attractive, connected infrastructure. What's missing? Implementing an electric vehicle, car sharing in low-income communities. Didn't have that anywhere. The biggest obstacle to increasing the use is a lack of facilities. There's nothing in this goal about additional funding for facilities. Good comment.
Elizabeth is offering a story of how she goes to Journey East restaurant, which gives the bicycle discount of 10%. So having local businesses on board.
Another comment about funding, additional funding needed for this. Education comment, education of city councils on the importance of active transportation connectivity. Most don't understand why we need it, and most don't have a way to fund it or don't think it's a priority. As a cyclist and a distance runner, I enjoy those activities more when there's a bike shop nearby and a specialty shoe store. I think most people will enjoy these activities more and do them more if they, if the supporting businesses are available nearby. Okay, there is wheelchair accessibility, cutouts at intersections, broken glass on paths and bridges. Need education about that. Frequent messaging on the very strong benefits of health and independence, and to cleaner air. To touch on that. Work proactively with city officials to change their attitudes about active transportation. We need to add inviting and accessible to mobility. We need to then there's also, we're missing the prioritizing vulnerable users in planning and building, passive detection of pedestrians and cyclists and prioritizing their movement since they are exposed to the elements. We need to start young with messaging. Needs to be a consideration of integration of public transportation, especially considering complete streets. And this is only applicable with communities that have transit systems. We don't just want to get the scraps in planning decisions. We need funding, and more funding. Assistance to other communities wishing to develop rails to trails. The person that commented assistance to counties and communities wishing to develop rails to trails. Can you unmute and share? Is that a funding comment or is that a technical assistance type of comment? Or put in the chat to elaborate on your response. There is another comment that says work to illuminate stigmas about cyclist behavior. Many drivers think that cyclists are a danger to themselves, but most accidents involving cyclists and cars are the motorist's fault. We need safe, attractive, connected, green infrastructure mobility. It should be enhanced through design strategies like tree canopy, reduction of urban heat island effects, stream bed restoration to maintain integrity of streamway trails, etc. Would like expounding on the complete streets policy. What is the exclusive to KDOT, I would guess? What is this? And what are the goals of possible policy?
So the Rails to Trails comment came from Gary, and his elaboration was, my Rail to Trail comment is for technical assistance. Funding can be generated locally. Okay,
go ahead, Tammy.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add a little bit more detail on the complete streets. So this is something that there's been a couple attempts, I believe, at the state level of passing a statewide complete streets policy that would really require more routine accommodation on state projects to look at active transportation needs. So that's what the Complete Streets policy is. We're recommending passing a statewide Complete Streets policy, but I did want to also explain that we're kind of taking the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach at the same time. So in addition to recommending a Complete Streets law, we're also recommending a number of internal changes and processes within KDOT that have more checklists, more internal routine consideration and accommodation of active transportation needs, and really making some internal recommendations for institutionalizing more of those things. A lot of those things KDOT has started to do in recent years, and we're looking for ways that those can be more institutionalized. And then just the last thing I wanted to mention is that a number of cities across the state do have a Complete Streets policy, particularly in the larger metropolitan areas, but that's something that we would encourage, as well as is the passing of local Complete Streets policies and laws.
Alex had a question for you of, does this policy figure into the contract for this project?
Alex, do you mean in terms of writing the policy?
Yes, exactly so.
Well, we're working on the internal KDOT policies, but as far as writing a statewide law or policy, that's not part of what we're currently doing as part of this contract.
So you're, just for clarity, sorry, Tammy, for clarity's sake, you're suggesting that this needs to be a law passed by the legislature, or is this something that would be done through the internal processes of KDOT or perhaps other state agencies in combination with KDOT towards doing these things? Kind of curiosity. Can you specify on that, please?
Yeah, so both. I think the passing of a state law would be fantastic, but obviously KDOT's not going to pass. You know, that has to happen in the state legislature, and there needs to be a group lobbying for that, which has happened, unfortunately, unsuccessfully in the past. But we don't want to take it off the table. But in the meantime, we think working on those internal policies is an important step. And again, a lot of it has already happened at KDOT. They've really changed a lot of internal policies, but we want to make sure those are institutionalized. Does that help answer your question, Alex?
Yes, I think so. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Let's go to the next thing, which is what should be the priority? What should we focus on with mobility? A lot of your other comments for what's missing had to do with funding, so that could fall in the other category. But we had the acceptance culture component of active transportation, and then we had the infrastructure component. And then you all added some new ideas. So what do you think is most important to start on first? Which of those categories is most important? And for those that are just joining the meeting, this is the morning session for the Kansas Active Transportation Plan. And what we're doing is we're doing a plan to make it easy for people to walk, bike, run, skate, board, etc., to get from place to place. And it's a statewide project. And what we've been doing is we have been going through the goals and the action steps associated with that planning document. And so everything is a draft recommendation right now. And what people are doing is they are commenting on the goals and action steps, adding to them what's missing where needed. And now we're also prioritizing each of the topics that relate to each of the goals. And so right now we're focusing on mobility, where we have 2 categories, maybe 3 categories of things: the culture and acceptance, the infrastructure, and then other information that we gather about mobility. And a lot of that, I think, had to do with funding and policy.
And there is and I just wanted to add, there is a second meeting at 5:30 this evening that will cover all the same materials. So if you missed a chunk of this meeting and want to attend that one, we welcome you to do so. It's the same link and it's 5:30.
looks like safe, attractive, connected infrastructure is in the lead. Don't see any more comments in the chat. I don't see any hands up, I don't think. If you are new to the meeting and you
I gave Phil the Mentimeter stuff, so he should be good. Yeah.
Thank you. I was going to say, I was going to ask you. We're in Mentimeter, and that's how we're commenting, and your comments are showing on screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next topic then. This is connectivity and accessibility. The goal is written in bold underneath the yellow text, connectivity and accessibility. So we're talking about eliminating the gaps and the barriers to create that comfortable, convenient, and attractive network for active transportation users of all types and abilities. We have our 5 categories. You can thumbs up, thumbs down, or give question marks, or give a question mark to how you feel overall about those action steps related to connectivity and accessibility. First category is land use and transportation connections. We've got subdivision and zoning requirements. We have planning and design. We've got routes and trails that are regional, and we have community cohesiveness. For connections, we want to have plans that focus on active transportation for communities of all sizes so that we can get that connected network. We also want to be sure that we prioritize networks that are going to be connecting to schools and recreation facilities and transit and services. And we had our previous meetings, we did talk about where people wanted to go, what they wanted to connect to. And so those types of destinations are among the top that we heard. We want to be sure that we accommodate the needs of people who are in non-motorized users of transportation on our roads and our bridges, and we want to work with schools to make sure that locations are accessible, walkable, bikeable. Subdivision regulations, we've got the requirements for connectivity and best practices in how you separate vehicular traffic from non-vehicular traffic. We've got certain amenities that could be included with zoning, might require zoning adjustments, like short and long-term bicycle parking and fix-it stations and showers. Planning and design. We want to be sure that we encourage best practices. We want to have best practice guides for routine maintenance and repair of our active transportation system, which we're focusing on sidewalks and ramps and crossings. We had a safety goal, which is how we kicked off this conversation. And so safety is also embedded into planning and design. We've got our trails in here, and then community cohesiveness, which is reducing the barriers that divide our communities. And those barriers are often the bridges and overpasses. So half of you all have voted so far. If you've already voted, continue to look at the screen and see if there's something that's missing, because that's the next question that I'm going to ask you, is what's missing from what we've outlined so far. Okay, a little over half of you have voted. That's usually about the number. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Got a lot of thumbs up on that, no thumbs down or question marks. Here are the categories again, but what's missing? We've got the connections, as a type of action step. We've got the zoning requirements, planning and design, the trails and cohesiveness. The bike network needs to connect to jobs too. We're missing that part. Someone says we're okay where we are. Looking good. Okay, under maintenance, snow removal, defining roles and responsibilities at the state, county, and local level. We might as well add sweeping, okay? I know that can be an issue. Sweeping, snow removal, all of that. Who's doing it and when are they doing it and how often? Okay, on-site bike ped design requirements need to be included in the zoning action so that we don't just get people to the property, but to the front door too. Encourage environmental considerations and minimum design standards. Becca, do you see anything in the chat?
Nope, nothing yet.
Let's see. Okay. Mapping out everything in the state. We've got to find the gaps. Gateways and signage may be good inclusions here. Okay. It's good for wayfinding too. Funding and the understanding of property ownership among rails to trails. People don't like thinking that the rails to trails infringing on their property rights. Hydration and rest stops along trail routes. Consider shelter, shade, and safety considerations. Need to include some language about collaboration between city police and county sheriffs to protect cyclists. For example, when a cyclist gets attacked by dogs outside the city limits, the county sheriff is often unresponsive or apathetic. Suggest that instead of referring to rails to trails, just say trails. We need trails and walk, bike, wheelchair routes that aren't necessarily where a train once ran. Another one about funding. Possibly dedicate funding for planning projects for communities. 2 steps, planning it out and then applying for the funding. Unleashed dogs and their influence on active transportation is a big issue. Get the idea to have communities adjust zoning or find places for parking, but having showers or other end-of-facility services for bicyclists might be hard for smaller communities. That's an expense for something that might only be used a few times. I found that school principals, wonderful as they are in some ways, or so many ways, lose interest entirely at the school sidewalks. School boards also want to assume that every student has a chauffeur, not want to think about walking or biking to school. There's a lot of new things in this one. Okay. So what's most important then? Is it some of those new things that you were talking about? Is it the cohesiveness, the idea of trails, planning and design, the requirements for development, so your subdivision and zoning, or is it land use and transportation connections? Planning and design is winning so far.
A comment here from Bob says regional routes and trails, build it and they will come.
I know people have packed schedules. As the meeting goes on, we lose more people. We have 38 now, and about half, a little under half have voted. I know there are staff here. Are there others voting? So we're always at about half vote who are in the meeting.
Therese, I think it would be okay to go on, especially because we only have about 5 more minutes. and we could make sure we capture those last quick questions.
1 second. So here's our health goals and our health topic. How are we doing here? What's your general opinion of our health action steps? Really, we have one with a bunch of sub-bulletins about partnering. We want to work with local and state health agencies to promote and fund active transportation programs and infrastructure. And we've got different types of options for that. You've got the safe routes to school, the healthy food, the commuting support at work sites, and so on.
And I see one of our first thumbs down. So if that person could provide any more detail, that would help us better understand.
And you can unmute yourself, or you can just put it in the chat and we'll read it aloud. Okay, I'm going to go to the next element of this because about half of you have voted. Whoops, hold on. What's missing in here? Got a thumbs down. It may have to do with something that's missing. It might not. And Scott is saying he thinks the goal is underdeveloped. It will take more than partnering to make it happen. Gotcha. Help us develop it, Scott. What else can we add to that for health?
We have another note in here from Phil who said this feels a little like roll up your sleeve Kansas, and I think the health aspects of good surfaces could work too.
So the physical activity plan is referenced. That's a great effort. We can connect to that. Want to know what metrics would be used for health and transportation relationships. Don't forget the usual partners like the EDC, regional health groups, municipalities, the regional grant providers, Kansas City Health Foundation, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and so on. Because of time, I'm going to move to the next thing. I feel like I know what the response to this is going to be, but what do you think is most important, the partnering or the other elements that you all, some of you all have mentioned in the chat or on screen?
I have a comment here from Erica who says health can equate community health, environmental health, public health, social services, and establishing baseline and metrics.
And we have a lot of content that we needed to share with you all and discuss today. And so it's 12 o'clock. What I would love to know if it is possible to have 10 to 15 more minutes of your time. Can you all give me a thumbs up in the chat or say yes or no in the chat if that's possible?
Seeing quite a few thumbs up from the group.
You have to drop off. We totally understand. This takes a little bit longer to get into this than I think we had planned for our meeting. But I see there's a lot of feedback on partnering, that's important. So let me go to the next thing so we can stay in the vicinity of not keeping you too late. This is community vibrancy. this is one of the other goals that we have, which is all about leveraging transportation investments. You can see that it is shorter than other goals that we have shared with you today. What we want to know is, rather than how do you feel about, the action steps, what's shown on screen is really more like our approach to tackling community vibrancy. So we think we should focus on active transportation. We think we should layer in the other goals like safety and mobility. And we have an economic impact analysis that's going on right now. And so we want to tie in the findings of that into community vibrancy. What do you think about that approach? You give us a thumbs up, a thumbs down, question marks, etc. And some thumbs up. We haven't gone off the rails. Okay. About half of you are voting, just kind of the normal number or so. Let me go to the next thing. These are the elements in our approach. Is there anything that's missing? Again, community vibrancy is about the tourism component. It layers in the other goals, and we want to think about the economic impact analysis. If we're missing something, please share your thoughts, what it is. If we're okay, let us know that we're okay.
Alex from Mark commented that he thinks this one needs more elaboration at some point. He contemplated using a question mark instead of a thumbs up.
Gotcha.
And Bob would like us to use examples from other successful programs like Missouri's or the Katy Trail.
Mm-hmm. Got one okay, and I need to flesh this out. This one is, yep, enigmatic, but seems on the right path.
And if I could just ask, and maybe this is a place folks could put it in, would this be better tied in with another goal or as part of the vision? Or do you like it as the standalone?
I'm seeing a comment in here of tying it into the sustainability or resiliency option.
That's a good comment, because my next question is about sustainability. Neighborliness is important in our personal, mental, and civic wellness. Goals to be walk and bike friendly communities as determined through walk and bike scores. Okay, that's a good comment. Someone likes it standalone. Okay, let me go to something else. Just again, I'm moving along because of time. Okay. Someone mentioned sustainability. We have been looking at sustainability, and right now we have the definition of it, which is to reduce resilience on single occupancy vehicles through maintenance of existing infrastructure and investment in transportation that moves all Kansans safely and comfortably regardless of travel mode. But what's the best approach? Should it be standalone or integrated into other goals? And I see Donna saying, I think we are all community vitality contributors, so it would fit with every other area. Maybe standalone, maybe integrated. Maybe something else. If you voted other,
It looks like the group is struggling just as much as we were with this particular one.
Well, and if you marked other, can you drop in the chat or unmute to tell us what you have in mind for other?
So this is Alex. I put other, and this is a difficult one for me too. I wonder if we could think, if you all would, I may have brought this up last time or the time before or the time before that. I don't know. I'm a bit of a broken record, but tying it perhaps into environmental issues as well might be a way to do that. I wonder if single occupancy vehicles is the way to do it. I suggested in the chat to tie it to VMT instead. Again, up for debate. I'm certainly willing to have conversations about that. But yeah, I mean, I think the idea is a solid one. I wonder if that couldn't be tied to green infrastructure a little bit more heavily, or I don't know. That's a tough one. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'm also seeing here in the chat from Tim, we can probably all agree that sustainability is a good goal. It'll be harder to get rid of someday if it's a standalone policy. It might be easier to get rid of sustainability language if it's just a part of the other policies. And a comment from Erica, who's agreeing with Alex. Casey Climate Action Plan Goal 4, increase resilience of the transportation system to shocks and stresses, address vulnerable infrastructure.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next thing. This is also related to sustainability. We were wondering about this approach to it. Sustainability could also have to do with maintenance and preservation, and one might argue that you might have a maintenance and preservation goal or topic. What do you all think of the idea of sustainability as maintenance or preservation? Is that a thumbs up, thumbs down, a question mark?
Phil actually just mentioned in the chat that sustainable means integrated into maintenance program. So I think he's right on that same page.
Mm-hmm. If you put a question mark, I see one question mark for that. This idea, would you elaborate on what you're thinking there? You can drop it in the chat or you could unmute and share your thoughts verbally.
This is Erica. I just think that resilience is really what is all inclusive of this if we're talking about flooding and other impacts to infrastructure, and how we're, covering the many different areas that we have today, from trails to roads, and the resiliency language addresses that.
Thank you. See a thumbs down. Another person that had a question mark. If you want to share what you're thinking there, drop it in the chat or unmute. Because we want to know then if some of you who like the idea of maintenance and preservation, are there action steps that we need to include? And so if it's more resiliency focused, if there are action steps that go with that, let us know what those are.
We have a comment from Jane in Wichita saying reducing cars and trucks, active transportation will benefit air quality, reduce asthma, and more.
Mm-hmm. And the green infrastructure component from Alex. Could be part of this. And there's some echoes about green infrastructure in the chat as well. Green infrastructure and resiliency. Anything else? It's kind of a tough one. much better, and many more bike lanes and sidewalks. I don't think DOTs think beyond the life cycle of projects, which is a major part of their job. I acknowledge that. And I think about impacts to the area's environment and public health as well. Require maintenance and preservation plans to be included in plan or project development. In the chat.
There's one from Diana. She said, I would like to see the sustainability goal revised to emphasize opening the way for all types of transportation and mobility, but not with the suppression of traditional vehicles. That'll put a large group of people off unnecessarily. I walk and bike and want those options to be more viable, but don't want anyone to, including myself, be shamed for driving a car.
Gotcha. I lost my ability to scroll. Okay, we have 2 minutes remaining in our extended period of time. Tammy, here's our next step slide. Do you want to close and maybe give to KDOT to finish up?
Yeah, so thanks everybody for sticking with us with the extended time as well. I think that there was a lot of information to dive into this morning. And, you know, at times we had almost 50 people on the call. So I really appreciate y'all sticking with us and being so honest in your conversation and your suggestions in the chat and through the Menti. So that's really, really helpful. And we've got it all documented. So we will be able to use this information to revise those recommendations, which is what we'll be working on. You know, through the end of June and on into July, is finalizing those recommendations. Wanted to mention a couple other things that we'll be doing over the summer. We are doing a couple standalone toolkits. One is related to active tourism. One is related to planning for active transportation in small and mid-sized communities. And then the third one is more of an internal resource guide related to active transportation accommodation on bridges and overpasses. So, well, primarily on bridges, we'll touch on overpasses a little bit. So those are some things that we'll be working on over the summer. And then the other piece, which I think is kind of one of the more challenging pieces of this plan, is developing performance measures to go along with these goals. And then also to start prioritizing and developing an implementation plan. So all of this is with the goal of having draft plan at the end of the summer or early fall that we'll be sharing with the public online for comment. You know, just wanted to mention, going back to performance measures, that's something we've heard both in February and then touched on a little bit in this meeting. It will be important to measure how we are doing on these recommendations. So that will be part of the plan. I'll also say that in some cases, some of the things we're recommending are very hard to measure, but we're not going to shy away from those things because I think some of the things are really important to include in the plan, even if they're hard to measure. So there will be a focus on performance measures, but we're not taking off recommendations just because we can't come up with a good way to measure it. I think with that, I just wanted to say there is this other meeting at 5:30 this afternoon. It's the same link. So, you know, encourage friends, family, coworkers to attend that. It will be the same content. So if you're super dedicated and want to join us again, you absolutely can, but it's the same content. So we encourage you to ask others to join us. And again, thanks for all your time. And Jenny or Matt, did you want to add any final thoughts?
No, that it was a really great and engaged crowd today. Like, I really enjoyed all of your comments. Thank you so much for joining, and look forward to working with you.
Yeah, happy. It was so engaging. Lots of feedback. It was awesome.
Great, thanks. And then if you didn't get a chance to put your name and email and organization in the chat and are still able to do that, that would be great. We'll have a good record of who attended this meeting and can follow up. And other than that, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.